Hello and good morning, afternoon and evening to our global audience. I'm Trisha, the CEO and co-founder of Unit 21. Thank you all for joining today's webinar on how crypto organizations fight fraud and stay compliant in 2021. We would like to share a disclaimer that we're working with both Crypto.com as well as BitPay and that we will be recording this event. Before we dive in, for folks less familiar with Unit 21, Unit 21 is a set of no-code tools for risk and compliance operations teams focused on transaction monitoring for fraud and AML, case management and SAR filing, and identity verification. We founded Unit 21 back in December of 2018 and are fortunate to work with industry-defining companies like Chime, Intuit, Coinbase, Crypto.com, and BitPay. Our position in the market has given us a unique perspective on this insanely fast-growing ecosystem of crypto, as well as the challenges and approaches that different organizations are taking. We're really excited to have this platform where we can discuss this new world, so to say, and exchange learnings and best practices. Today, we're very excited to interview two individuals leading crypto fraud and compliance readiness. Eden Doniger, the General Counsel and Chief Compliance Officer at BitPay, along with Antonio Alvarez, the Chief Compliance Officer at Crypto.com. I'll let Eden and Antonio introduce themselves. Eden, please take it away.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Great. Thanks for having me, Trisha and Antonio. I'm excited to be here today. As you said, I'm the General Counsel and Chief Compliance Officer of BitPay, which is the world's global leading cryptocurrency payment processor. Been around for about 10 years, and we're headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia.
Hello, everybody. Antonio Alvarez, Chief Compliance Officer for Crypto.com. Pleasure to be here and sharing this opportunity with Trisha and Eden. Crypto.com is a full-service consumer finance company that looks to harvest the power of crypto and the innovation of crypto to provide additional value to consumers around the world for their financial needs and enabling them to grow. We are around the world through provide our services through apps and websites.
Awesome. Thank you both for taking the time to join us today and share your knowledge with our listeners around the world. One last housekeeping item before we begin. We're hoping for an involved discussion with everyone joining us today and want to ask anyone who would like to submit any questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, or email alexander@unit21.ai, and we'll get back to you shortly. So without further ado, let's get started. So Antonio, Eden, let's say that we have a founder, they want to start a crypto company. They maybe had a product engineering, business development background. They have this groundbreaking idea of how individuals or businesses should use crypto. What are the first things that they should do from a risk and compliance standpoint, especially for these folks who may not really be that aware of risk and compliance operations needs in financial services? What advice do you give them? When should they hire a CCO? How should they think about everything?
Mm-hmm. I'll take the first one, Eden. I would say that it is very important for them to understand that the line between technology and financial services. They're getting into an industry that is rightly called fintech, and they need to understand how much of fin and how much of tech is going to be involved in their products. So really having a compliance officer or legal counsel through the initial design of the processes to understand what are the licenses they're going to need, what are the controls, what policies, what registrations from a regulatory perspective, and how to tweak their product and their offerings to either lessen that burden or increase it if they think that is going to be value for them. I always tell people that ask me this question that, crypto companies don't sell socks. Right, we sell financial services, so we're a lot closer to a bank than we are to a Walmart. So they need to be very, very conscious of that, especially from people that are coming in with great technology-based ideas, great ideas on how to build a platform, to understand that it's not just a platform. Just because you can program it doesn't mean that you can do it.
I'll add a few thoughts to that. One of the things I think is most important probably is coming at it with a compliance by design mindset. You hear about things like privacy by design and security by design. And so kind of tagging onto what Antonio said is, as you're designing your product and services, compliance should be equally important and embedded into the design. There's a couple reasons why. One is you'll get a lot more, the go-to-market strategy will be a lot more successful, because most of the customers out there that you're probably going to want to interact with, depending on what kind of a crypto company you are, but are actually going to really care about that in today's day and age. Maybe they wouldn't have as much a few years back, but now they really do. And you may have a lot of obstacles to adoption of what you're offering if you haven't done that and you can't prove that you've done that. Then second, obviously, regulators are going to be much more confident in what you're offering when they come to look and understand it, if you can prove that you've done that. And then third, of course, maybe most important, is just that you will have a much better shot at avoiding some serious bad moments down the road that you could have avoided if you just had invested that mindset and the resources into it at the beginning. And I think one of the pitfalls for companies is having sort of a scrappy startup attitude as they get their company going, which is really common. So they might think, oh, we can't really prioritize and spend money on a chief compliance officer yet. Maybe in a few years we'll get that going. Or on outside counsel right now. And, maybe this person can do compliance as their sort of second job off the side of their desk. Or the CFO, can't they do compliance? They're risk-oriented people. Or hiring new people who are completely inexperienced in compliance in the space. Those are the kinds of common mistakes that I think a lot of new companies in the space make, and it comes to haunt them down the road.
Yeah. It's amazing. Yeah, sorry, I was going to just add a quick thing as well, just coming with it, saying as well that it's amazing how in those situations they underestimate the requirements, right? You would never think about building a car without putting seatbelts on it, right? Or bumpers, right? And those are regulatory requirements on a product, and you would never even thought about it. So building a financial product without KYC or without the proper compliance controls, it would be the same, right? It's like building a car without seatbelts.
Yeah, that's a really good point, that compliance is instrumental. It's not a check the checkbox function. It's instrumental in defining the GTM for the business, the product innovation, and potential expansion opportunities. So thank you for sharing that. I'm curious, with respect to KYC, KYB, how do you both think it changes for, let's say, a regular fintech versus a company dealing with crypto?
Maybe I'll jump in. I think it mostly has to do, well, there's two main things. One is crypto's different, right? There's a lot of, it's newer technology. There's a lot of change happens quickly in the space. There's new products and services and features that get rolled out pretty quickly by companies. And each one of those could have its own new regulatory risk or impact that has to be taken into consideration. That is unique. And there's not necessarily any playbook for that or guidance out there or framework that you can just turn to and open a book and feel like you're confident on exactly what the answer is. So there has to be a lot of proactive analysis on the risks and the controls that you need. And then the second thing I would say is just, the spotlight is on crypto right now in the regulatory world more than just general fintech space. A lot of different regulators are looking and thinking about this and asking really tough questions and deciding what their role is going to be in the space as a regulator. There's a lot of conflicting regulations and laws and frameworks that may or may not apply. So in terms of just unpacking all that and then planning ahead for what may come from that, that's a unique challenge facing any crypto company versus just some other kind of fintech, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would say as well, the other big difference between when it comes to KYC is the expectations from your business partners, your banking partners. They're always going to look at crypto as a high risk or a higher risk even than fintech, and they're going to they're going to expect with stronger controls, especially in knowing your customers. Crypto has this. Everybody thinks of crypto as anonymous, right? And it's not. It's pseudo anonymous. The blockchain, and there's a lot that we can dig into that. But from a partner perspective, the banks, your sponsor bank, your payment processors, all of them, they're not crypto enthusiasts, to say the least, and they don't tend to be crypto experts. So they look at it and say, "Oh, crypto is anonymous, so your KYC has to be, a lot, double that what anybody else would do." In order for them to do business with you. So beyond the regulations is the expectations of the banking partners that is going to drive a much more structure and a much more focused KYC and KYP processes.
Yeah, and in addition, because of that, there's also a lot more expectation and need for the crypto company to educate their bank partner or their regulator really on why you've made a decision you've made. It may be a little outside the norm from a compliance program perspective, but there may be a very important reason why you did that, and you have to be ready to explain that and even defend that as something reasonable and something that they should be able to get comfortable with too, and that can be challenging.
Yeah, that's a really good point. With essentially without a sponsor bank or a payment processor, the company can't even really get started. And so it's really important that companies do the most that they can in educating their respective audiences about why they've made certain decisions. I'm curious, with respect to blockchain analytics tools, so there's a bunch out there. How do you evaluate them? When do you think is the right time to get different blockchain analytics tools?
Well, from a time perspective, I think that you should get if you're a crypto company, you should get a blockchain analytic tool about a week before you form the company. It's like the sooner the better. You need to start getting used to the blockchain, understanding the blockchain, and the analytics tool is a perfect way, or actually the only way to really understand how the blockchain works and how to treat it. In terms of selecting one, from my perspective, it's just it's another vendor, right? So you need to look at it like any other vendor and look at what is the pricing, what is the customer support they're going to give you, how important you are to them, how important they are to you, that relationship, up times, etc. But what it's also very important is the coins that they support. The emphasis. So there's different tools out there are built with different approaches and different strategies within the companies. Some of them they tend to be more focused on law enforcement and get a lot more information from their clients and use client information for the good of the community. Others, they focus more on the security aspects of it, and they look more into the IP addresses that are in the blockchain or the security around and security metadata that comes around all the transactions. So you want to have a combination of them. I would definitely recommend somebody to start with one, probably the easiest one, and then build from there. But it's likely that you're going to end up with more than one. Also, because the blockchain, you're going to use it as an API, right? In order to risk rate your processes, your transactions, more as a prevention perspective, but also as an investigative tool. So you want to have you want to evaluate the user interface, the how easy it is, how intuitive, and how much information they give you up front as you're researching specific cases and trying to navigate through that blockchain that can be very confusing. It's looking like for a needle in the haystack, and the blockchain is the haystack, right? It's not lack of information. Sometimes it's too much information when you're working.
Yeah, and whatever tool you choose, you're going to have people on your team who really become expert at those tools, right? This isn't just like, you think about tools that you generally may be familiar with if you're in a legal or compliance role that are sort of GRC tools. They're very intuitive and easy to learn, and become quickly competent with. And when it comes to blockchain monitoring and analytics tools, there's more of a learning curve. It's going to take longer, especially if you're not naturally very technical. And so I think that's a challenge that takes time. And so planning for that is important. If you're choosing a tool and also building a team where you're going to have one or more people who their kind of direct responsibilities to work with that tool, they're not going to be using it beautifully and competently overnight, right? And they're going to be confused for a while, and they're going to need a lot of help. So one of the other things I wanted to mention is how important it is to form a close kind of partnership with the company that you choose, where they can help you as often and as much as you need with weird questions that come up and difficult problems you're solving for and things that are hard to understand. You should be able to get on the phone with them and have that kind of partnership, which, we're fortunate we have with our provider. And I think all the leading providers out there are like that. And it's really nice because maybe 4 or 5 years ago, there wasn't nearly as much on the market for crypto compliance tools in general, right? It was harder to find tools and they weren't that great. They've improved tremendously. There's a lot of options out there. And in fact, a lot of competition between them, and so a lot of features constantly being rolled out that are really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really fascinating how the needs and the complexities for blockchain analytics tools are really unique in terms of the coin coverage, etc. And as the company scales, there needs to be more investment into using more of these tools to get more coverage, but also to educate your own team members on how to make the most out of it. Okay, great. So shifting gears a bit, I'd love to get your thoughts on this emerging trend of FRAML, of combining fraud and anti-money laundering compliance in one team, in one organizational function within the company, and really creating processes for both of them to be met with the same kind of tooling and the same kind of operations folks.
So this is a great topic, and I think there's this weird tension between reality and ideal state, right? For smaller startups and for companies that are maybe not resourced enough to do it in the ideal way. But I guess maybe, Antonio, I'll start with what's the practical realities are. You're starting a new company, and again, it goes back to that other point of where you need to staff up and spend money on certain things. You may not be able to afford or justify affording right away, separate people in separate roles. And so the default is often going to be that, the CFO and the CCO are your kind of natural risk managers in their roles. And therefore, fraud prevention, fraud detection, a fraud program would tend to just kind of be thought of as rolling up under them, because that's the most logical people. So I think the reality is that that's often how things start and stay for a while. And it's not that that's horrible. There's certain things about that can work, but it really is not the ideal way to set all of that up, I think. And maybe I'll flip it to Antonio to go into, I know we've talked about this, some real strong feelings about how you should set that up.
Yeah. I do. Because of the inherent motivation that comes from it. And the way I look at it is that what motivates a fraud compliance and a risk officer that is doing fraud compliance is to protect the P&L of the company. At the end of the day, it's about reducing fraud losses specifically, not necessarily reducing fraud. And I say that because sometimes the tools that you have at hand are not, they're not escapables, right? They're not that fine cutting tools where you can cut the fat without touching the flesh. You have to take some of the flesh with you. And sometimes it pays to leave a little bit of the fat in order to preserve that flesh. I know that it's a bad picture and it's very violent, but I think it summarizes it, that sometimes you have to let a little bit of the fraud through in order to preserve the good transactions, and because they pay for the fraud itself. So it's a good economic decision to be done. That actually contradicts with the compliance goal. The compliance goal is to ensure that there's no crime, financial crimes being done with your products. That it's much more black and white. It's much more conservative approach. Letting a few good customers doesn't justify to let one money laundering go through or one terrorist financer. Regulators don't see it that way. So you have a much more conservative, a much risk adverse approach to it. When you combine those two roles in one, you're creating a conflict within the role. You're especially in situations that come in and say, yeah, but if I take the compliance approach, I'm going to damage the P&L. And that's a conversation that a compliance officer has to have with the CEO. But when it has it with himself, it becomes very, very hard.
So I wanted to add to that is I think maybe the best solution for that conundrum is if your company has a culture of compliance first, right, where your CEO, your CFO, and all your other executive teams share in the same desire to keep bad actors out no matter what, then they're going to be more inclined to make conservative decisions anyway, right? They're not going to want to have their reputation and their future at risk because of maybe a few dollars, right? More than that. But so I think it all starts there, right? I think it would be very hard to work at a company where the CCO was really at odds with the CFO and the CEO on decisions like this. And then who's the ultimate decision maker, right? Who gets the final word? Do you have a risk committee that gets the final word? And who's on that risk committee? So a lot of it has to do with governance. If you can't have the separation of duties, then you need to have that culture and that governance so that in the end of the day, the person making the ultimate judgment call is really making the right judgment call.
Yeah. Hey, that's exactly right, Eden. Because at the end of the day, companies work on conflict, right? A company works well when it's balanced, so that the marketing officer that is trying to spend every single dollar in ads, it's at conflict with the CFO that is trying to reduce cost, and it's at conflict with the sales organization that is trying to put people on the ground to sell, and the operation organization that is trying to. So there's always the different groups within the company. Are always going to have to be at odds with each other in order to create that balance, and that balance, to your point, is the culture of the company. It's that ultimate decision making is what's going to dictate how the company makes decisions and what risk appetite, what culture they have. So that's where my feelings are coming from. That achieving that balance.
That's a great point. And I guess one other thing I would add is simply embedding your CCO as much as you can in all aspects of the company. And if you can have a risk officer, that person as well. But embedding those people in all the discussions is really important, because that issue spotting ability, when you're moving super fast and you're rolling things out and you're making decisions quickly, if that person isn't in the room and can't hear those discussions and can't speak up and explain what the risk is and what they should do about it, then things can happen pretty quickly without them knowing. And so it goes back to that kind of how you set up the role and the governance.
This is clearly a very heated potential discussion within the company, and there's obviously no black and white answer, but there's clearly different incentives for compliance where you have to review every alert versus for fraud where you can really take a risk-based approach on what you want to let through versus not. And but I think there's a bunch of different cultural aspects and processes that the company can put to make sure that it's not a significant strain if one individual is responsible for both.
And Tricia, we have to recognize we always focus on the tension but we do have to recognize that there's a lot of overlap, right? A lot of the tools that fraud uses are common to compliance, and from a cost perspective, makes sense to leverage and work very collaborative together. I just want to make sure that is clear, that we're not saying that it has to be a dichotomy and they have to work against each other. It has to be a very collaborative process regardless.
Okay. Thank you both for sharing your thoughts on this incredibly heated discussion whenever we talk to any company about it. So I'm curious, with respect to operationalizing compliance, how do you think about it? What type of people do you hire? With crypto companies, it's interesting because the space is so young. So how do you find the right people? How do you evaluate them? And how do you make sure that they're being successful in their role?
You want to take it first? No, I'll follow.
Sure. I would say, going to say very patiently. There's a lot of demand out there. There's a lot of need for compliance, so it's not an abundant source of. Especially, I find it that, especially because compliance people tend to be more risk adverse. So getting somebody from compliance to venture into crypto it's the first hurdle, right? That you have to get through. Operationalize it and structuring the roles within compliance is very important, because it's compliance. We talk about compliance, but there's many different aspects of it, right? We talked about the advisory aspect of compliance, working with product, designing products. We talk about the operational aspects of compliance, running KYC or filing SARS, the creative, investigative side of compliance. There's very many different sets of skills. So it's getting somebody in the door that has the basics and that understands how compliance works in the traditional financial services, and if they have some crypto experience, even better. They have to have a crypto interest, but nobody was born knowing crypto, right? So it is, you have to teach, you have to evolve, you have to develop the people on the job. I and they have to align more than anything with the culture and the risk appetite of the company. That you cannot teach or you cannot train an attitude or risk appetite. That's something very personal that you need to evaluate as part of the recruitment process. In my preference as well, like to fit in my culture, for example, I always look for people that are more entrepreneurial, that want to take ownership of a role, ownership of a responsibility. People that are not going to be, I don't have to tell them what to do or how to do it. They're going to come in, find a problem, figure it out, and move through, and just let me know how they're moving along. And so I can help them be successful in their roles, rather than walking them through how to be successful in their role, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with everything you just said. And maybe a few extra points would be, there's a tendency, I think, or an inclination when you're looking for new compliance individuals at a crypto company to find and hire people who are really new to compliance. This may be their first professional career move, or maybe that they did something completely different and they're just curious and interested in compliance now, which is great, which means they have that kind of natural interest and hunger and entrepreneurial spirit, but they might not have sufficient background, and there's a ton they have to learn. There's a huge learning curve, and they may not have just even the foundational compliance training that you would want on your team. So there is a real risk to hiring that type of person into the role. Not that they couldn't be smart, hardworking, and do great, but it may be a year or 2 years before you kind of start to see that level of comfort and confidence in them. On the other hand, you could hire someone who's pretty senior in compliance from a banking world background, they're so steeped in sort of the traditional way of thinking and operating, and it's very predictable and sort of to what Antonio was saying, they kind of expect that everything will go a certain way, and they don't have enough of an entrepreneurial mindset, and it will be very hard for them to change their approach and thinking as they move into this role, even if they think it sounds kind of exciting and intriguing and different. Maybe they're kind of sick of what they've been doing for years, but at the same time, the learning curve there can be really high. So I think sort of the sweet spot is to find people who have at least a few years of compliance experience at a bank or a fintech or whatever. Maybe not crypto yet, that's okay, but they're not brand new at this, but they also are still sort of inherently entrepreneurial, inherently hungry for learning new things and thinking outside the box. I agree with him that probably the most important thing is people who are creative problem solvers, because every day something's going to come in the door that there is no precedent for. And everyone's got to work together quickly to figure out the right risk-based solution.
Yeah, creative problem solvers. Very difficult to find, but I completely agree that that's really what the bar needs to be for this incredibly new space where things are moving really quickly.
Mhm.
So, moving on to the components of actually operationalizing compliance, Antonio, I'm curious with respect to Crypto.com supports NFTs. Can you tell us more about with NFTs? How have the vectors of attack changed? What are the things that you are thinking about as as this new way of moving value is coming into play?
Right. NFTs is a incredibly exciting space. A lot of, it was a fad, right? At the beginning of the year, it became very popular. The NFTs, it's kind of fading away a little bit, although still strong. But it's important to understand what NFTs are, right? NFTs are not cryptocurrencies. So let me start there, just to set the stage. A cryptocurrency is a digital representation of value, like Bitcoin, Ether. They're representing a value, a fungible value. While NFTs, non-fungible tokens, are a digital representation of an asset, of a very specific asset that has a value in it, rather than being a representation of value. It's a small distinction, but I think it's very important. So when you're buying and selling NFTs, you are buying and selling assets. Now, the what becomes a more complex is that because NFTs that tend to be traded, and the people active on NFT tend to be very familiar with crypto, they're using crypto to buy and sell NFTs as well. So you have all the components of an e-commerce transaction with the components of a crypto transaction on a space that where the assets are actually on the blockchain. So because the assets are on the blockchain, they're fully traceable, and they're always tied, or they can be tied to a smart contract that is, tracing in the value of those assets. So when it comes to investigations, when it comes to monitoring, it creates an additional dimension for us. So we're not only monitoring the users and the behavior of the users, the behavior of the buyer, the behavior of the seller, even the behavior of the creator, which is the artist that creates that, or the concert company that is creating that NFT to be sold as a primary sale, but also the buyers and the sellers that are buying and selling in the secondary market. So that creates its own dynamic. But what we're putting another dimension on it is from the point of view of the NFT itself. um, because NFTs are piece of art. A lot of them, their value is dictated by demand and supply, and the ability of an actor to raise the demand artificially in order to launder money is very real. The Because of the, again, the pseudo anonymity of the blockchain, it may be an easier space to be able to do that. So when we're developing our investigation and our monitoring tools, we have to overlay and track the NFTs, the value, and the users, not only from the behavior of the user, but also from the point of view of the NFT as a central part, the NFT itself as a central part of the investigation and the monitoring the rules. Did that explain? It gets a little complex, so and I get into my own head when it comes to these things, but
Yeah, no, that's really. Thank you for shedding light on that. And I think the most fascinating part is that no one talked about this potential concept last year, or the maybe the beginning of this year, and now it's become such a big space with new vectors of attack that you have to monitor for, which really underlies how crypto is changing so incredibly fast, and you have to keep up with regulations and new vectors of attack very quickly as well. So
it's
thank you,
interesting.
Antonio.
No, it's interesting. Sorry, just to add something. It's interesting in the NFTs because when we monitor a transaction, this is usually a two-party transaction. But you have to think that on an NFT transaction, you may have three or four parties. So when I sell an NFT on the secondary market, there's a buyer that makes the payment, but part of that payment goes to the original creator from a royalties perspective, because the NFT is controlled by the smart contract that can drive those royalties for the life of the asset. Think about it like a piece of music, like a song, right? Every time they play it on the radio, the original artist gets a few cents, right? Same thing. Every time an NFT is sold on the blockchain and in a marketplace or in different marketplaces that are connected by the blockchain, the original creator is still getting paid for every transaction, along with the platform that is providing the service, the buyer and the seller. So now you start seeing the complexity of some of the additional complexity in monitoring when you're looking at a four-party transaction on a regular basis.
Right. Yeah, and it's so unique compared to any other transaction that people see. It, like you said, it's like an art or a song, and it's not just something that typically we don't see that much in the financial ecosystem. But yeah, it's really interesting. The evolution of the space underscores how the need for agility is so fundamentally important, and it's really great that companies like Crypto.com and BitPay are really defining what the thinking around this should be like. So Eden, would love to learn from you. You work with a lot of different types of merchants. How do you think of merchant risk? How do you incorporate that in your internal transaction monitoring?
Yeah, so unlike an exchange, being a payment processor, our customers are businesses, small, medium, large, all over the world. So our KYC AML program is primarily built around merchant risk and merchant screening. And obviously, with crypto payments, you're more often than not dealing with e-commerce type services or financial services. Again, certain industries where, kind of like NFTs, where it attracts crypto spenders. Now, I think things are changing a lot. We've seen a lot of adoption in the last year in the more mainstream kind of merchant industries. And we're heading that way where people are looking to spend crypto on more everyday items. But historically, it's been more like sort of specific kinds of goods and services that a lot of our merchants have a lot of success with their crypto transactions. So it's shifting, but I would say that, just like any other financial services company, we're doing thorough due diligence and customer identification and everything we need to do on our merchants, because we need to make sure that this merchant that has a website that claims to be offering whatever the services across the world is actually really doing that, and that their crypto transactions that come in are commensurate with what you would expect for what they are selling, right? And that there's not some kind of suspicious disconnect, something that doesn't feel right about that. So there's a lot of our monitoring program is focused on reviewing kind of that whole stream, downstream relationship of the goods and services being offered and who's buying them and why and how often. And so we're able to leverage both our blockchain monitoring tool and Unit 21 to, in combination to look for all those kinds of possible red flags. So I think for us, it's great. We have marquee customers that are publicly traded companies where, you can have a lot of confidence in them, right? And in the onboarding process, it's pretty easy, but there's plenty of companies out there that, we've never heard of them before. They come to us, they're excited to offer the option to pay in crypto. And they really have to show us what is the business case for that, and why is that going to happen, and who's going to be spending crypto with you and why, and really understand that.
Yeah, so changing monitoring policies and needs based on different risk profiles.
Exactly.
Great. Thank you both for shedding light on, for your specific companies, how things have evolved over the last year. With respect to monitoring, I'd love to learn more about how has Unit 21 been useful and helpful since you started working with us.
I'll start, but for me, it's been the flexibility of adapting to our needs, right? Especially when we're in an industry that is so innovative, things like NFTs, you have to step back and think about, how am I going to monitor these? What are got to put your black hat on and think about, if I'm a crook how I'm going to exploit this, and what are the signs and the typologies that I need to start developing against. Typologies that you just have to think through. That you cannot go from case to typology. You have to create the typologies out of just pure evil thought, right? In a way, and then look at what is a traditional monitoring tool can give me to monitor that and to detect those. And it's never going to be a one-to-one, right? I'm going to be looking at, especially for NFT, I had to resource and look at how our auction houses look for these things, and then what type of tools do they use, which are very different than the banks, the financial institutions. And partnering with somebody like Unit 21 that can start developing and understands my business and my challenges, can be flexible and have a tool that is flexible enough to start introducing those components into the program.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I also think what's been nice for us is, for some time we had our great blockchain monitoring system and tool and program, but not sort of the behavioral monitoring side yet. And so we chose Unit 21 to get that set up. And what's been really nice is that it's designed to be compatible with the blockchain monitoring tool that we use. And so it becomes sort of a one-stop shop where everything is flowing through this one system instead of having to deal with sort of two standalone systems. So that's been great. And then also, we have identified a lot of instances of unique needs that we have as a crypto payment processor, where it would be great if the tool could do this or that, and have found that I think when you're working with an innovative reg tech company like Unit 21, you get a lot of responsiveness for that, right? There's sort of a nimble approach of, let's solve this, and our other crypto clients would probably like that too. So you're sort of, it's nice because it's like we're a thought leader partner with you as we forge ahead and kind of enhance and make our program more sophisticated as it can be to solve for things that, like, I'll just give you an example, like the suspicious activity reporting form for the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN. It's not designed for a crypto company. And there are plenty of parts of the form where, a field doesn't quite make sense, but we have to fill it out, or we want to provide some information that isn't available. There's no field you can fill in. So we either can have a very manual kind of weird approach to solve for that, or we can work with Unit 21 to come up with workarounds. How can we automate this a little better? How can we make this work? And I think Unit 21 has been great with that, because your mindset is also very innovative.
Thank you. We're really honored to be working with both of you, and it's really been a privilege to grow the company with folks who are really pushing what the industry looks like and how compliance should really be a core function within the company to push further GTM motions and new development. So thank you both for your kind words. The last question I have, and then we have so many questions from the audience, but the last question I had is, what do you think is the future of regulation in crypto? What advice would you give to companies today when things are just changing so rapidly from a regulatory standpoint?
Eden, you want to take this one first?
Yeah, I mean, I know we don't have too much time. We could go on forever with that one, but I think I'll just try to keep it pithy, which is be prepared for anything, right? There's so much that's still being developed and figured out. I don't think it is a good plan to go into your compliance program and into your interactions with regulators full of sort of ego about it, right? I think it's really important to be have some humility, right? You're trying to design something innovative and new, but effective and safe. And there's no such thing as perfection with that, but there is such a thing as sort of good faith, best efforts that are reasonable and defensible. And what we've found is, in our interactions with our regulators, it's been a very positive experience to talk through some of those things, right? And to explain why we've made decisions we've made and what the challenges are and what we're trying to achieve. There's a lot of credibility with that. And I think you've seen some examples in the recent years of companies that I think have way too much kind of hubris about it. Like you're going to do what they're going to do and, make a lot of money and not care. And the chickens do come to roost when that's your approach. So I think that that's probably not the best approach to take.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I would only add that it's good to put yourself in the shoes of the regulator as well, right? These are brand new, innovative, technologies that we are learning about, and we're in the industry, right? And we're living these and have access to engineers that are thinking through these things. And here comes a regulator that is examining or overseeing a number of financial services companies around the country. One of them, or a few of them, has been crypto, so they're learning through the process. There's also another aspect that I think is very interesting, is the dynamic between the regulator and the legislator. We're seeing more and more where the regulator is learning faster than the legislator is, because they are day to day working with the crypto companies. They're understanding the technology because they're seeing it. But yet they know, so they know what they need to do. They understand it a little better now, but there is no legislative agenda to support them. There's no laws or the statutes haven't been updated fast enough, because the legislator is behind this, behind the in the race. And that creates that a lot of that friction that you see and that frustration that you see in regulators as well, which I think is good to be more empathic with.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point of, people often think as the public sector as the regulators, but really there is division between regulators as well as the legislators. And it's important for companies to recognize that, in order to really start influencing how essentially the government thinks about crypto. So thank you so much. That was a fantastic program. It seems like we really covered everything. There are a few key takeaways for me and for the broader audience. The first is that you're not selling socks. You're really creating a fintech company with the fin, which is really important, as well as the tech. And it's really important to have a compliance by design mentality from even before you start the company. The second is it's really important to align with the culture and risk appetite of the company as you hire for operations folks to really operationalize your compliance program. And it's really important to get those creative problem solvers who are entrepreneurial, have some background, but are not just stuck in their ways. And the final is that the space is constantly changing. There are new vectors of attack. There are new things that come up every 6 months. And it's really important to keep customizability, flexibility at the core, and keep educating your regulators about how things have been changing and how you're approaching it. So thank you both for really the fantastic amount of content we've been able to cover in such a short time. So we have a bunch of questions from the audience that we'll try to at least get a few answered. So can you spend a minute sharing your thoughts on the travel rule and the proposal on CTRs for virtual currency?
I'm happy to do that. The travel rule I think we talk about the differentiation between the legislator and the regulator, right? It's one of those where, especially in the US, the regulator, which is FinCEN, is looking at it and say, I have a law that says that you have to comply. So I don't have an option to select if you need to comply or not. You have to comply. Yet, an industry where there's so many challenges to comply with the travel rule, right? From so many questions that are unanswered. How do you tackle a transaction with a DeFi wallet, right? A non-custodial wallet. There's nothing in the law that talks about that or makes any type of reference to it, because it's new technology that wasn't conceived in 1996 when the travel rule was passed, right? There's so many of these challenges that we need to, as an industry, we need to work with the regulator to bridge the gap to the legislation, because that's what they're working with, right? A legislation that is outdated, but they have no choice but to implement it. So without getting into all the nitty-gritty of the challenges with the travel rule, The VCTR itself, it's an option. I think it's an alternative. We see countries like Canada just implementing VCTRs for transactions over $10,000. It's a lot more. It puts more of the onerous into the government, because that's who you're giving the data to, rather than your counterparty on a transaction. And I'm just wondering, at this point, is the regulator and the in those countries ready to receive that data and to do what it takes with that data in order to make it effective? But we are preparing, and we're getting ready to start filing VCTRs in places like Canada, implementing the travel rule in places that are really driving the requirement, like Singapore. So you just have to be abreast of everything that's happening, and try to, again, like we were saying before, come into the regulator with humility and say, I understood this requirement. This is how my risk assessment is, how I'm trying my best in my environment, in my innovation, how I'm complying with it, and hope to find a common ground, and a collaborative and cooperative relationship with them.
Yeah, and at BitPay, we undertook a travel rule solution in-house a couple of years ago. After analyzing it for a long time and in discussions with our regulators, and it wasn't something we really felt that we were sure we should have to do at that point, but it was more of this is where everything's headed. This is right around the corner, one way or the other. And, that's kind of back to the idea of, the industry is changing so much, and there's so much of a focus on innovation with compliance wrapped around it in the space we're in. And so we made that business decision to adopt a solution that our regulators would be pleased with a little earlier on. I do think, though, to Antonio's point, for companies that are struggling with that or trying to figure out what to do about it, I guess my advice would be, don't wait much longer. This is all happening, right? The finer details of what it's going to mean and how it's going to work are still kind of being figured out, but I think it's inevitable. And so it won't go over well if you're not ready when the time comes, if you're just so far behind in getting your solution figured out and implemented, because it does take a lot of time to put one in place and figure out what's going to be right for your company. So just plan ahead. This is happening.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts on this. We only have time for maybe one last question, so I'm going to combine two questions from the audience. What is one trend that, in terms of fraud, that you would recommend people look out for? One red flag to watch out for?
You want to go first on this one? After me, I can go. We'll think through it.
You go first.
For us, yes, for us, it's not different than the traditional finance. I mean, when it comes to fraud and scams, I mean, you do have the ransomware that are more particular to crypto. Even though it's not necessarily new, it's just that they're using crypto as a ransom instead of Western Union, right? Or instead of another type of financial service. There are, but social engineering, account takeovers, sextortions. The trends are not that different in the crypto environment that is in the fintech or in a remittance or e-commerce world.
Yeah, I think probably overall you're seeing a lot of attempts, the usual attempts to get people roped into some kind of get-rich-quick scheme. The Twitter-based fraud and hack that happened a year ago, impersonating, celebrities and trying to gain people's trust. I mean, that's again, social engineering. It's an age-old kind of technique right now in the world of security and fraud. But at the same time, I think people are the average person out there doesn't really understand crypto that well yet. And I think therefore can fall victim to crypto kind of related fraud more easily if they're not educated about it. So, consumer awareness and knowledge is critical to avoiding those things. But I think from the perspective of a company like Crypto.com or BitPay, I mean, we're on the lookout for a whole litany of kinds of fraud at all times, right? I don't know that one stands out more than another. So that's our job, right? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you both. That's all we've got time for today. So thank you all for joining us. If you'd like to speak to us further, please email alexander@unit21.ai and we will get back to you shortly. And most importantly, thank you, Eden. Thank you, Antonio, for sharing your wisdom, your experience, your time with us today. Hopefully talk soon and see all of you at the next Unit 21 event.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.